Richard Hawthorne adjusted his tie in the mirror, taking a moment to appreciate the reflection of the man he had become. The opulence of his San Francisco mansion surrounded him, a testament to his success. The gleaming marble floors, the intricate chandeliers, and the expansive views of the bay all spoke of wealth, earned through hard work and determination. Yet, despite the lavish surroundings, Richard felt a sense of disquiet, a nagging suspicion that perhaps he had been too trusting in the past, too willing to believe in the integrity of others. Today, he would test that belief. Clara, the young woman he had invited for an interview, arrived promptly at 10 Danoy. She stepped into the grand foyer, her wide eyes taking in the beauty of the mansion. Richard noted her modest attire, a simple navy dress, slightly wrinkled but neat. There was an earnestness about her, a sincerity that intrigued him. He gestured for her to take a seat in the opulent sitting room, the sunlight pouring in through the tall windows. "Thank you for coming, Clara," Richard began, his voice steady but formal. "I've reviewed your application, and I must say your references speak highly of you." "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne," Clara replied, her voice soft but clear. "I appreciate the opportunity to interview for this position." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I want to know more about you. You come from a modest background, don't you? What made you apply for this position?" Clara hesitated for a moment. "I grew up in a small town. My family struggled to make ends meet, and I've always worked hard to support them. I left home to find better opportunities and, well, I want to prove that I can succeed, even if it means starting from the bottom." Richard nodded, impressed by her determination. "You understand the responsibilities involved in this role? It's not just about cleaning, it's about trust and integrity. I need someone I can rely on completely." "Absolutely, sir. I'm committed to doing my best and earning your trust," Clara assured him, her gaze steady. Richard leaned forward, intrigued by her confidence. "What would you do if you found something valuable that didn't belong to you? For example, let's say you found a large sum of cash in my study." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I would bring it to you immediately. It wouldn't feel right to keep something that isn't mine." "Honesty is a rare trait these days," Richard remarked, a hint of skepticism threading through his tone. "I had my share of disappointments with people I thought I could trust." "I understand, sir," Clara replied, her expression earnest. "But I assure you, I'm not like those people." Richard studied her for a moment longer before deciding. "All right, Clara. I'm willing to give you a chance. You're hired. But know that I'll be watching closely." A flicker of relief crossed Clara's face as she smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I won't let you down." As Clara left the interview, Richard felt a mix of hope and apprehension. She seemed genuine, but the weight of his past experiences lingered in his mind. He had been betrayed before, and the scars of those betrayals ran deep. Could he really trust her? Later that evening, Richard sat in his study, contemplating his next move. He had decided to set a test for Clara, a way to gauge her integrity without her knowledge. He opened his safe, a sleek high-security model embedded in the wall, and placed a substantial amount of cash inside. It was a significant sum, enough to tempt someone with less scruples. He left the safe open, allowing Clara to see the money inside, and then activated the surveillance cameras hidden around the room. "Let's see what you're made of, Clara," he muttered under his breath, a sense of unease settling in his chest. He knew this was a gamble, but he felt compelled to take it. Trust had to be earned, not given freely. The following morning, Clara arrived bright and early, ready to start her first day. Richard watched her through the camera feed from his desk, intrigued by her diligent approach to her work. She moved gracefully through the rooms, dusting and vacuuming with a focused determination. Every now and then she would pause to admire the paintings on the walls, or gaze out the window at the bustling city below. Richard found himself softening at her enthusiasm. It was a stark contrast to the bitter disappointment he had experienced with previous employees. "Clara, can you come here for a moment?" he called through the intercom, feigning casualness. "Of course, sir," she replied, hurrying into the study. Richard watched her enter, her expression a mixture of curiosity and eagerness. "Just wanted to check how you're settling in. Any questions so far?" he asked, maintaining a relaxed demeanor. "No, everything is going well. I'm really enjoying it," Clara replied, her eyes bright. Richard nodded, but internally he wrestled with his doubts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a dangerous game. He continued to monitor her throughout the day, noting how she interacted with the household. As the sun began to set, Richard felt a mix of hope and anxiety. Clara had shown promise, but the test was far from over. He was left with a spiraling curiosity. Would she remain true to her word, or would the temptation of easy money prove too great? In the dim light of his study, he replayed the footage from earlier in the day, looking for any sign of dishonesty. Clara moved around the safe, dusting the shelves nearby, occasionally glancing at the open door of the safe. Richard's heart raced with each moment of hesitation he perceived. Was she simply admiring the cash, or was she weighing her options? Richard needed to know if Clara was different. As the clock struck midnight, he shut off the footage, fatigue washing over him. His mind raced with thoughts of trust and betrayal, and he knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Would Clara rise to the occasion, or would she succumb to the seduction of greed? The answers lay ahead, and he was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. Richard Hawthorne spent the following days immersed in the quiet rhythm of his mansion, while simultaneously consumed by the tension of his secret experiment. Each evening, he would retreat to his study, eyes glued to the bank of monitors displaying the live feed from the hidden cameras he had strategically placed throughout the house. He was captivated by the sight of Clara, the young maid he had recently hired, moving gracefully through the opulent spaces of his home. Clara embodied a refreshing contrast to the lavish surroundings. Her simplicity radiated a genuine warmth that Richard found oddly comforting. She meticulously dusted the ornate furniture, her fingers gliding over the surfaces with a tender care that spoke of her upbringing. As Richard watched her, he noted how she hummed softly to herself, seemingly lost in her work, her brow occasionally furrowing in concentration. He leaned closer to the screen, intrigued by her demeanor, which belied the doubts he harbored about her integrity. One day, he watched as she cleaned the grand piano in the living room. Clara paused, her fingers brushing over the keys, and she played a few notes, a wistful melody that filled the empty space. Richard couldn't help but admire her talent, a hidden facet of her personality that the cameras had inadvertently captured. He felt a strange pang of guilt for invading her privacy, yet the stakes felt too high for him to abandon the surveillance. "Why can't I shake this feeling of mistrust?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe if I just give her a chance." As the week progressed, Richard observed Clara's interactions with others in the neighborhood. During one of her breaks, she ventured outside to chat with his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. The two women laughed together, Clara leaning in close to listen as Mrs. Thompson recounted stories of the past. Richard found himself smiling at the sight, the warmth of their exchange dissolving some of the cold skepticism that had settled in his heart. Who knew she could be so engaging, he mused, his mind drifting to the possibility of giving Clara a raise. Perhaps he had misjudged her. Later that evening, as Richard reviewed the day's footage, he felt a sense of relief beginning to wash over him. Clara's actions seemed genuinely kind, her laughter infectious. "Maybe I can trust her," he whispered to himself, feeling the weight of his doubts begin to lift. Maybe she's different. However, the respite was short-lived. One particular night, while reviewing the tapes, Richard noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The clock in the corner of the screen indicated it was nearing midnight, and the house was quiet. Clara appeared on camera, moving stealthily through the dimly lit hallway toward the study. Richard's heart raced as he leaned forward, his breath hitching in his throat. Clara paused outside the open safe, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the desk lamp. She stood there for a moment, her head tilted slightly, as if contemplating her next move. Richard's fingers gripped the edge of his desk, his mind racing with a tumult of thoughts. Is she going to take the money? He breathed, his stomach tightening with anxiety. After all this time, is she really just like the rest? She lingered, her expression unreadable, and Richard felt a wave of panic wash over him. He had built his life on trust. Trust that had been shattered too many times before. The thought of Clara, the seemingly innocent maid, succumbing to temptation felt like a betrayal he was not prepared to face again. "Come on, Clara," he whispered, half hoping she could hear him. "Don't do this," but she didn't move. Instead, she turned her head slightly, glancing around the room as if sensing she was being watched. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't anticipated this level of awareness from her. It was both alarming and oddly impressive. After what felt like an eternity, Clara stepped back, shaking her head as if in defeat. She turned away from the safe, returning to her tasks with a renewed sense of purpose. Richard exhaled, his heart still racing, but for a different reason now. He felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Why hadn't she taken the money? Had she really been tempted? Or was this all part of some elaborate act? The following morning, Richard found himself grappling with his emotions. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, preparing for the day, but his mind was elsewhere. The image of Clara's hesitant stance by the safe replayed in his mind. He had to confront her about it. But how? Would she admit to her temptation, or would she deny it and leave him grappling with his suspicions? As he made his way downstairs, he resolved to act casually. Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, filling him with a sense of normalcy he desperately sought. She looked up as he entered, a smile breaking across her face. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne. I hope you're ready for a great day," she chirped, her enthusiasm infectious. He couldn't help but smile back, even as doubt lingered in the recesses of his mind. "Morning, Clara. I was just reviewing some footage from the past few days." Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "Oh, everything all right? Of course," he replied, perhaps too quickly. "I'm just impressed by how thorough you've been. Your work ethic is commendable." "Thank you," she beamed, her gratitude genuine. Richard hesitated, the urge to probe further almost overwhelming. But he held back, choosing instead to engage in light conversation about her family and interests. As they spoke, he noticed the passion in her voice when she recounted her love for cooking, and her dreams of one day opening a small cafe. "Maybe I could help you with that," Richard suggested, surprising even himself. "I have some contacts in the restaurant industry." "Really? That would be amazing." Clara's eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a moment, Richard forgot the swirling doubts in his mind. As the conversation flowed, Richard pushed aside the nagging thoughts of the safe. Perhaps it was time to let go of suspicion. Clara was proving to be a valued asset to his life, and he needed to embrace that. But as the day wore on, he couldn't shake the unease that settled like a weight in his chest. Later that afternoon, as he reviewed the footage again, Richard found himself torn between admiration and paranoia. Clara's laughter echoed through the hallways, her kindness infectious, yet that brief moment of hesitation by the safe haunted him. He turned away from the monitor, frustration blooming in his chest. "Why can't I just trust her?" he muttered, pacing the room. But the answer eluded him. Trust was a fragile thing, and Richard had learned that lesson the hard way. The walls of his mansion felt like they were closing in on him, a gilded cage that echoed with the weight of his fears. Would he ever be able to truly let someone in again? As night fell, Richard prepared for bed, the shadows in the house elongating and shifting around him. He could still hear Clara's laughter from the kitchen as she tidied up after dinner. The warmth of it seeped through the walls, but it was not enough to dispel the chill that gripped his heart. In the quiet of his room, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, battling the ghosts of his past. The cameras had shown him a glimpse of Clara's world, but now they seemed like a double-edged sword, revealing both her light and the darkness of his own suspicions. And as sleep finally began to claim him, Richard could not shake the feeling that the true test of Clara's integrity was still to come. The morning sun filtered through the tall, elegant windows of Richard Hawthorne's mansion, casting intricate patterns across the polished marble floors. Richard stood in his expansive study, the air thick with tension as he prepared to confront Clara about the safe. His heart raced, torn between his instinct to distrust and a flicker of hope that she might genuinely be the trustworthy person he desperately wanted her to be. As Clara entered the room, her usual bright demeanor seemed slightly muted. She wore a crisp white blouse, paired with a knee-length black skirt, her dark hair neatly tied back. Richard noticed the way her hands fidgeted slightly, betraying a hint of anxiety. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain a casual facade. "Good morning, Clara," he began, leaning against the large oak desk. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. What's on your mind?" Clara asked, her voice steady but her eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. "I noticed the safe was left open yesterday. Did you happen to see it?" Clara's expression shifted to one of confusion, her brows furrowing. "The safe? No, I didn't even realize it was open. I've been focused on cleaning the living room and organizing the kitchen." She shrugged, a hint of innocence in her tone. "I'm sorry if that caused any trouble." Richard studied her closely, searching for any signs of deception. "You didn't feel tempted to take a look? I mean, there's quite a bit of cash in there, Mr. Hawthorne," she replied earnestly. "I would never do something like that. I have no interest in your money. I'm just here to work." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. The sincerity in her voice tugged at Richard's resolve, yet a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Was she really as innocent as she claimed? He started to wonder if he was being overly paranoid. "I appreciate your honesty, Clara," he said slowly, "but I have to admit, I am concerned about security in my home. I need to know I can trust you." "I understand, sir. And I promise you can trust me," she said, her voice softening. "I'm just trying to make a living." Richard nodded, his chest tightening. He wanted to believe her, but the memories of past betrayals loomed over him like a dark cloud. He watched as she turned to leave, the door clicking shut behind her, and sighed deeply. He felt the weight of his wealth pressing on his shoulders, a burden of suspicion and fear. Later that day, Richard found himself back in front of the surveillance monitor, replaying the footage from the past few days. Clara's diligent work ethic was undeniable. She scrubbed floors, dusted shelves, and even cared for the plants in the sunroom with a tender touch. Yet, as he continued to watch, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. In one clip, Clara paused in front of the open safe, her gaze lingering a moment too long. Richard's heart raced as he leaned closer to the screen, replaying the moment. Did she hesitate? Was it just curiosity, or was there something more? His mind spiraled with doubt. He'd been so quick to dismiss his instincts, hoping for redemption in Clara's character. "What are you hiding, Clara?" he muttered under his breath, frustration boiling beneath the surface. The following evening, Richard's pulse quickened as he noticed something unusual on the footage. Late at night, the motion sensors alerted him to a figure outside the mansion. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Clara was outside, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. But she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure loomed beside her, their features obscured by the darkness. Richard's heart raced as he watched them talk, their voices muffled but animated. He strained to catch a word, any hint of what was transpiring. A sense of betrayal washed over him. Who was this stranger, and why was Clara meeting them in secret? "Clara," he whispered, disbelief pouring through him. "What are you doing?" He replayed the footage multiple times, scrutinizing their body language, the way Clara shifted nervously, glancing around as if checking for someone. The stranger's gestures were emphatic, and Richard frowned, trying to decipher the conversation. A knot tightened in his stomach. He felt as if he were watching a scene unfold in a thriller novel, where the hero was always one step behind. Finally, he decided he could no longer remain passive. He had to confront her again, this time armed with the knowledge of her late-night rendezvous. Richard's mind raced with possibilities, each more sinister than the last. Was she involved in something illicit? Was this stranger a thief or worse? By the time Clara returned to work the next day, Richard had resolved to face her. He stood in the study, his heart pounding as she walked in, her usual bright smile dimmed by the weight of his scrutiny. "Clara," he began, his voice firm, "I saw you last night with someone outside." Her expression changed instantly, a mixture of shock and fear crossing her face. "What do you mean?" she stammered, her eyes widening. "I saw the footage," he pressed, crossing his arms. "You were outside with a stranger." "Who was that?" Clara's demeanor shifted, and for a moment he saw vulnerability flicker in her eyes. It was just a friend," she managed to say, but Richard could hear the tremor in her voice. "A friend?" he echoed, skepticism dripping from his words. "At night? In front of my house?" He felt the anger rising, a tempest of emotions threatening to spill over. "You have to understand how this looks from my side. I have a lot at stake here." "I know, Mr. Hawthorne," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But I swear, it's not what it seems. He's an old friend from my hometown. I was just trying to help him." "Help him with what?" Richard pressed, refusing to back down. "You're putting my security at risk. I need to know if I can trust you, Clara." Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she held her ground. "I didn't mean to put you in this position. I just wanted to help him get back on his feet. He's been struggling, and I couldn't just turn my back on him." Richard's heart wavered. He wanted to be angry, to dismiss her excuses, but the earnestness in her voice tugged at his conscience. "You're putting your job, and my trust, on the line for someone you barely know. How can I believe you?" "Because I'm here to work for you," Clara replied, her voice steadying. "I need this job and I wouldn't risk it for anything. You have to believe me." Richard studied her, searching for any sign of deceit, but all he saw was a young woman desperate to do the right thing. A part of him wanted to trust her, to believe that she was different from those who had betrayed him before. But the shadows of doubt loomed large, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. "I need some time to think," he finally said, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He watched as Clara's expression shifted from worry to resignation, the fight leaving her eyes. He felt a pang of regret. This was not the way he wanted their relationship to unfold. Clara nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping. "I understand," she whispered, turning to leave. The door clicked shut behind her, and Richard was left alone in the silence of the study. The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated his face, revealing a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Clara, the young woman he had hired only weeks before, had become an enigma to him. He had intended to expose her potential dishonesty through his little test, but the deeper he dug, the more tangled the web seemed to become. He rifled through the sparse information he had managed to gather about Clara. It was alarming how little was available. Her past was like an open book with missing pages, and every detail he uncovered raised more questions than it answered. Clara had grown up in a small town, and her records showed a series of odd coincidences, transient jobs and sudden moves. Was she running from something? Or was her life simply a reflection of someone trying to find their way in a world that had not been kind? Richard rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the tension build. He had become increasingly obsessed with uncovering the truth about Clara. The surveillance footage had provided a glimpse into her daily life, revealing a diligent worker who seemed genuinely committed to her job. Yet, that one night, when he had seen her with a mysterious figure, had shattered his fragile trust. The image of her standing under the moonlight, speaking with someone who had not been introduced into his world, haunted him. His thoughts drifted back to the moment he had first caught sight of her on camera, the way she had looked at the safe, her expression a mix of curiosity and restraint. He had wanted to believe she was innocent, but the fleeting glances and hesitations were hard to ignore. Later that evening, Richard resumed his surveillance routine, seeking solace in the familiar glow of the screens. He watched Clara diligently clean the mansion, her movements fluid and graceful. But as the hours passed, a new curiosity arose. He noticed her retreating to a small corner of the library, a place he had not previously observed. As Clara settled in, Richard leaned closer to the screen, his heart racing with anticipation. What was she doing? He watched as she pulled out a notebook, flipping through the pages with an intensity that suggested more than just idle thoughts. She scribbled furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. What could be so important that she needed to hide it from him? "Clara," he called out, testing the waters, but she didn't respond. He felt an overwhelming urge to confront her again, to demand answers about what was happening in that hidden corner. But a part of him hesitated, not wanting to invade her privacy any further. Yet curiosity gnawed at him, and he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would stake out that corner of the library, see for himself what she was working on. Perhaps it would provide the clarity he desperately sought, an insight into Clara's true intentions. As the night wore on, he replayed the footage in his mind. Each fleeting glance, every moment of hesitation. His instincts told him she was different, that she might not be the thief he initially feared. But, with the evidence of the visitor still fresh in his memory, Richard knew he had to remain vigilant. The next day he positioned himself strategically, finding a spot where he could observe without being seen. Clara entered the library, her demeanor focused and intense. She began to work on her project again, and Richard felt his heart beat faster. What would he uncover in this clandestine moment? Hours passed, and as he watched her scribble and erase, he felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Was she planning something? Was she truly innocent? Or was there a deeper scheme at play? The questions spiraled in his mind, and as Clara leaned back, rubbing her temples in frustration, Richard felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. She was clearly working hard, and the effort she put into her project left him torn. Perhaps she was just a young woman trying to carve out a place in the world, battling her own obstacles. But the nagging doubts persisted. Richard's resolve deepened. He would get to the bottom of this. Whatever secrets Clara held, he would uncover them. He could not allow himself to be blindsided again, especially not by someone who had walked through his door with a smile and a promise of hard work. The stakes were too high, and the consequences of misplaced trust could be devastating. As the day drew to a close, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would confront Clara again, but this time he would be armed with knowledge. Knowledge that could either save their burgeoning relationship or shatter it completely. Richard's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions as he recalled the recent days. The way she had responded to his inquiries about the safe, her innocent denial, had it all been an act? Richard straightened up, a sudden resolve coursing through him. It was time to face Clara, to demand the truth. He strode out of the study, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor as he made his way to the kitchen, where he had seen her earlier preparing dinner. The aroma of garlic and herbs wafted through the air, a tantalizing scent that, under normal circumstances, would have made his stomach growl. But now, all he could think about was the confrontation looming ahead. Clara stood by the stove, stirring a pot of simmering sauce, her brow furrowed in concentration. She turned as Richard entered, her face lighting up with a smile that momentarily softened his heart. "Mr. Hahn, dinner will be ready in just a few minutes. I hope you're hungry." Richard cleared his throat, the weight of his questions hanging heavy in the air. "Clara, we need to talk." The cheerfulness in her expression faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of concern. "Is everything okay?" He gestured for her to sit at the small kitchen table, the surface gleaming under the warm light. "Please, take a seat." Clara hesitated for a moment but complied, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I need to know about the late-night visitor you had. The one I saw on the cameras." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment Richard thought he saw a flash of fear cross her face. "Mr. Hawthorne, please just tell me the truth," he interrupted, his voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "Was it a friend? Or was it someone involved in something illegal?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was my brother Ethan. He's been in trouble, and I didn't know how to help him." Richard's chest tightened at her admission. "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "He got involved with the wrong crowd. I've been trying to get him out of it, but it's difficult. I thought if I could just talk to him, maybe I could convince him to change." Richard watched her, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in his mind. The desperation in her voice struck a chord within him. "So, you were trying to help him? That's why you met him late at night?" "Yes," Clara replied, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want you to find out. I thought if I could just keep my head down and do my job, maybe it wouldn't affect anything here. I didn't want to put you at risk." Richard's heart softened at her honesty, but a flicker of doubt still lingered. "Clara, you have to understand that trust is everything in this world. I've been betrayed before. It's hard for me to let my guard down." "I know," she said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "But I promise I would never do anything to hurt you. I just need this job. I need to support my family." Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of her confession settling on his shoulders like a heavy mantle. "What do you mean? Are you in financial trouble?" Clara nodded, her voice cracking. "I lost my last job when the family I worked for moved away. My mother is sick, and I'm the only one who can take care of her. I was desperate to find work, and when I saw your ad, I thought it was a chance for a fresh start." Richard felt a pang of empathy wash over him. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the raw honesty that resonated with him. "Clara, I appreciate your honesty, but you have to understand that the world we live in is full of risks. I can't afford to be naive." "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But please give me another chance. I'll prove to you that I'm trustworthy. I'll do whatever it takes." For a moment, Richard was silent, wrestling with his own fears and the flicker of hope that Clara's sincerity ignited within him. He had been so quick to judge, so eager to protect himself from potential betrayal, that he had almost overlooked the humanity of the woman sitting before him. "All right," he finally said, his voice steady. "I'll give you another chance. But I need you to promise me that you'll be honest with me from now on. No more secrets." Clara met his gaze, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I promise, Mr. Hawthorne. You won't regret it." Richard nodded, but as he watched her wipe her tears, a nagging doubt continued to gnaw at him. Was he making a mistake? Could he truly trust her? Or was this just another layer of deception waiting to unfold? The complexities of human nature weighed heavily on him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the fragile balance between trust and betrayal teetering precariously. As Clara returned to the stove, the tension in the room began to dissipate, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. He found himself lost in thought, the lines between right and wrong blurring with every passing moment. In that moment, he realized that the world he had built around himself, one of wealth and power, was as fragile as the trust he had just extended to Clara. He would keep a watchful eye on her, but perhaps it was time to let down some of his defenses. After all, every relationship required a measure of risk, and maybe, just maybe, Clara was worth that risk. He had watched Clara for days, scrutinizing her every move, convinced she was hiding something. Yet nothing could prepare him for the revelation he was about to witness. As the video rolled on, Richard's heart raced. There was Clara, her petite figure framed against the backdrop of the grand study, but beside her stood a familiar face, Mark, his estranged business partner. Richard's stomach dropped as he leaned closer to the screen, his mind reeling. What could they possibly be discussing in hushed tones, their expressions shrouded in secrecy? Clara, he whispered to himself, disbelief mingling with anger. He had trusted her, had begun to see her as something more than just a maid. But now, the image of her standing next to Mark felt like a dagger to his heart. The man he had once considered a brother in business had betrayed him before, and it seemed he was now entangled in a web of deceit with Clara. The footage continued, revealing a scene that felt like a punch to the gut. Clara handed Mark a document, her fingers brushing against his, in a way that felt intimate and conspiratorial. Richard's breath hitched. What was in that document? Was it sensitive information about his business? A plan to undermine him? His mind raced with possibilities, each more harrowing than the last. He paused the video, his finger hovering over the mouse as he considered his next move. Confronting Clara was no longer a question of trust. It was a question of survival. She had turned his world upside down, and he needed to know the truth. With a sudden surge of determination, he stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floor, and made his way towards the hallway. Clara was likely in the kitchen, preparing for the morning's breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. As he approached, he found her humming softly, her back to him as she chopped vegetables with a practiced hand. "Clara," he said, his voice low but firm. She turned, surprise flickering across her features before she quickly masked it with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne. I was just—" "Save it," he interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, and she wiped her hands on a towel, apprehension settling into her posture. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is far from all right," he snapped, crossing his arms over his chest. "I saw you last night with Mark." Clara's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, and then to something deeper, fear. "What do you mean?" Richard stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I mean, I saw you handing him something. What was it?" "What are you two plotting, Mr. Hawthorne? I can explain." Clara stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not what you think." "Then enlighten me," he demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been playing me all along." She took a step back, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the towel. "You're wrong. I would never betray you. Mark is... he's my brother. Your brother. Your brother." Richard echoed, incredulity lacing his words. "The same brother you told me was involved in criminal activity?" "Yes, but it's complicated," Clara exclaimed, her eyes wide with desperation. "I was trying to help him. He needed money, and I thought—" "You thought what? That you could just go behind my back and conspire with him?" Richard's voice rose, echoing off the kitchen walls. "I wasn't conspiring. He came to me for help. I was trying to protect you, to keep him away from your business." Clara's voice was rising now, a mix of anger and hurt. "I didn't want him to come after you." Richard felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly smothered by his need for clarity. "And the document? What was it?" "It was nothing important," she insisted, her eyes bleeding. "It was just a note about his debts. I thought if I could show him a way out, he'd leave you alone. I was trying to keep you safe." Richard's heart wavered slightly at her sincerity, but the betrayal still stung. "You should have come to me. You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth." Clara's shoulders sagged, defeat washing over her. "I know, and I'm sorry. I just thought I could handle it. I didn't want to burden you with my family's problems." Richard turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He felt torn between the urge to believe her and the deep-seated fear of being taken advantage of once again. "You should understand that I can't allow anyone to threaten what I've built. I won't let my guard down again. Mr. Hawthorne, please." Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. "I care about you. I would never do anything to hurt you. I just wanted to protect you from my brother's mistakes." He glanced back at her, noting the tears gathering in her eyes. For a moment he felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. But how can I trust you now? Because I'm standing here telling you the truth, she implored, stepping closer, her eyes searching his. You've seen me work. You know I'm dedicated. I want to help you, not harm you. Richard hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The trust he had so carefully guarded felt like sand slipping through his fingers. And what if I find out that you've been lying again? Then you can fire me, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. But I promise you, I'm not like the others. I want to be honest with you. Please, just give me a chance to prove it. As silence enveloped them, Richard grappled with his thoughts. The betrayal hung heavy in the air, but Clara's earnestness tugged at something deep within him. But you must understand that I'm watching you, Clara. One misstep, and you're gone. Understood? She replied, her voice barely above a whisper. With that, Richard turned and left the kitchen, his heart in turmoil. The confrontation had left him more confused than before. Trust was a fragile thing, and he had yet to decide if Clara was worth the risk or just another player in the dangerous game of wealth and betrayal. As he walked away, the image of her standing there, vulnerable and earnest, lingered in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about loyalty and deceit.